Right. Be careful and put my watch up front to make sure I also stick to the timings. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've been fortunate that I've been able to travel to Malta several times with the Royal Navy, but given I take my cheque from the government, the first thing I always have to start with is this is me speaking and not Her Majesty's government, in case I get something completely wrong or cause an international incident. What I'd like to talk today is predominantly about Malta in the Second World War, and particularly the siege of Malta. One of the most intensive periods in Maltese history, and I think one where Malta's role is even more significant than it is generally acknowledged. The quote, the start there, is from Winston Churchill, I think, who is one of the people who really does appreciate the sort of vital, pivotal role of Malta. Now, we've already heard that Napoleon, in fact, also managed to sort of twig this pivotal role, and he is, as we've heard, also frustrated by Nelson. You always have to have Nelson in your lecture. It's kind of the law in our setup. And through to exactly that, the First World War, and the sort of international nature of Malta is illustrated by this. This is a Japanese destroyer, and there is, in fact, a flotilla of the Japanese Navy who are based in Malta from 1917 to 1918, who are hunting down Austro-Hungarian submarines in the Mediterranean. So Captain Von Trapp from The Sound of Music is one of the people that they are hunting at this point. So it really is a crossroads from this point of view. And in the Second World War, it was generally envisaged that the role of Malta would be similar to that in the First World War, that it would be a supporting area, a staging area, particularly in a war against Germany. Now that assumption really fell apart in almost what I call the strategic earthquake of 1940, the great German military success where they take over Holland and Norway, and in particular that they take over France. So these are forces being evacuated from Dunkirk. And so suddenly things have changed very, very significantly. Britain under Churchill decides that they're going to fight on, and the cartoon might say, alone, but in fact the British knew very well that they were not alone. The Commonwealth and Empire was an enormous resource, and it would have been hard to see Britain try and fight on without, including Malta and the Maltese. And the British start with almost one of the most ruthless actions of the war. This is the French harbour in North Africa at Oran, where the British bombarded it on the 3rd of July to sink French ships, killing 1,500 French sailors who we'd been closely allied with and literally playing football with 6 weeks beforehand. But Churchill's view was, and the government's view, was that we couldn't take the risk of these French ships possibly falling into the hands of the Germans or now the Italians, because the Italians have joined in the Second World War. Thinking that Hitler is going to win so easily, Mussolini is absolutely desperate to join the war and does so with basically no preparation whatsoever on the 10th of June 1940. One of the signs of this is in the first week of the war, the Italian Navy lose a third of their merchant ships, just because they hadn't got round to warning their merchant ships that they were going to join the war. So many of them are simply captured by the British immediately before they even know what's going on, or are interned in neutral ports. But Mussolini didn't mind about this because he was jumping on a bandwagon of a war that was going to be won very easily, and he was going to create and grow his new Roman Empire, as he put it. He'd already taken over Ethiopia, he'd already taken over Libya, and so his target, a bit like Napoleon's, was the idea that he could then take over Egypt and the Middle East. And Malta was going to be easy because Malta was already surrounded as far as he was concerned. Now, Malta, as we've already heard about, had very extensive British bases, and what had been added in the 1920s were also airfields in recognition of the rise of air power. But the main British fleet, it was decided, had to be withdrawn when Italy entered the war, because simply being surrounded by Italian bases made it too vulnerable. So it was decided that smaller forces would remain, particularly submarines and aircraft. And the British strategic view was that Malta was very much surrounded by Italian colonies, Italy itself and its bases, but that also made it effectively a kind of bone in the throat of the Italian system. You were there as an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the middle of the Italian Empire. And so the red circles are the increasing range of British aircraft during the war as they work out of Malta, And the blue lines are the Italian supply routes between Italy and Libya. And you can already see one of the successes of Malta in that those lines aren't taking the shortest route. They're already doing evasive routing in order to try and avoid the threats that come from Malta. Now, the Italians immediately into the war, so within 24 hours, the first air raid on Valletta. And something that I'm sure you're all familiar with, this is a Gloucester Gladiator. So hope, faith and charity, as they were known retrospectively in propaganda terms, and it is a propaganda element to it. There were actually 6 aircraft to start with, but not all of them. Some of them had to be cannibalised for spares and were damaged during the course of the defence of Malta. But from 6 aircraft, you could always generate at least 3 runners. So by having 3 aircraft always available, that was part of the propaganda and the morale of none of these aircraft were ever being damaged or shot down by the Italians. And faith, of course, is available to see in the National War Museum in Valletta. Now, there are other very high-tech British aircraft that are available in Malta. This is a Swordfish at the Fleet Air Arm, the naval component of the air component of the Royal Navy. And some of these aircraft were basically refugees from France that when the French decided they were going to pull out of the war, basically island hop all their way down to Malta, sort of literally borrowing fuel and things in order to try and escape the Germans and the Italians. So they end up in Malta, so you have the first striking force, as it was known. You've now got aircraft like this carrying a torpedo that can attack Italian ships. But Malta's first major contribution, there aren't major striking forces there, but what there are, they can put in aircraft that can look for the Italians, that can be the eyes and ears for British forces throughout the Mediterranean. And so by October, there are RAF aircraft looking for where the Italians are, and they spot the Italian fleet is held up in a port in Taranto in Italy. And so a British aircraft carrier, HMS Illustrious, is dispatched on that information to do an attack on the Italians in their harbour. 21 aircraft attack on the 11th of November 1940 and sink 3 Italian battleships. Because you're sinking them in harbour, 2 of them can ultimately be recovered. Only one is a total loss. But it's a big hit to the Italian forces, and it's one using the information that comes from Malta. So it's both a physical attack on the Italians and psychological. A lot of the British emphasis against Italy was building a psychological dominance over the Italian armed forces. And we decide that the army in the desert are going to cash this in as quickly as possible. Very low tech, but the important thing in the desert is seeing just a little bit further than the other guy from this point of view. And it's interesting that the British government was so invested in this attempt to take an offensive against the Italians that even before the Battle of Britain had started, 1/3 of Britain's tanks are taken away from defending against invasion and are shipped out to Egypt in order to have to launch this offensive against the Italians. And this was the result. There are 35,000 troops, and again, always Commonwealth, not just British. They're Australian, they're Indian troops. And they have a hugely successful campaign in North Africa. The 35,000 troops take 130,000 Italian prisoners. One regiment is asked to report how many Italian prisoners they've got. And they say, well, we think we've got about 5 acres of officers and 20 acres of other ranks. So it's very, very successful. It puts Italy back on the sort of back foot. And it also brings this man into the story. So General Erwin Rommel. So the Germans decide they must come to the aid of their ally, and the Germans enter this sort of never-ending battle for the Mediterranean, it seems, with Malta as one of the focus points. They first arrive, Rommel goes to North Africa, but also German air power appears in the Mediterranean, based again on Sicily, so leaving Malta very vulnerable. And this is the start of really, really serious bombing of Malta. But by late 1941, we've now also got British forces that can strike out of Malta. This is HMS Porpoise submarine, and Lieutenant William Bennington running it, sank 2 Italian supply ships in late 1941, awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for this. And so these Malta striking forces allow the British to have success in the desert because they're now sinking the Italian supply ships and reinforcement and the German ones that are coming through. They're very successful by the end of 1941, but the problem is now German aircraft are being diverted from Russia, and also the Japanese have entered the war, so it's very hard to crack on. And the Maltese now are being bombed. They are the most heavily bombed people on Earth at this stage. And by April 1942, in the single month of April 42, there are twice as many bombs dropped on Malta and was dropped on London throughout the entire Blitz of 1940-41. The air raid shelters that you see here, the privations of the Maltese people, many of them are holding down multiple jobs, things like working in the dockyards, but also doing air raid precautions. The health and the rationing is very, very hard. The casualty rate from air raids in Malta, which is about 1,500 people killed, 3,500 wounded, is 5 times that of the UK in proportion to the population. So Malta is very, very much the most frontline place in the Commonwealth. By middle of 1942, we've now got Spitfires, so there's some chance of holding off the German Air Force, but it's very hard to sustain forces in Malta. This is HMS Penelope, known to the crew as HMS Pepperpot, by the end of its stint in Malta, when it has to be withdrawn because of the damage. And rationing in Malta is now very, very severe. You have occasional fast ships like this, HMS Manxman, running in under cover of darkness, but it's impossible to bring in a full set of supplies. This is Lord Gort, who arrives as the Governor of Malta in in April 1942. When he arrives, he has to, bread is being rationed down to 10 ounces per person per day, and the ration is around 1,500 calories for the Maltese. Churchill is determined that Malta should hold out, so what he does, he has one of his action this day memos, where he is looking to send a large convoy into Malta in the summer of 1942, both for it to survive and for it to be able to strike back against the Germans and the Italians. And a key ship is this, the American ship, the Ohio, a fast tanker that has a chance of getting the vital fuel into Malta. An American tanker, but actually manned by a mixed crew of British and Americans for the operation. And a massive task group is put together, 3 aircraft carriers covering the ships in order to try and get this Operation Pedestal, the convoy through to save Malta from starvation. And it's subject to very, very heavy attacks as it crosses through the Mediterranean. This is the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle. She's just been hit by a German U-boat and is sinking. But also there's German dive bombers, basically through all the daylight hours of the advance of this convoy. So you've got these sort of guns on the ships trying to hold out, and merchant ships carrying fuel and ammunition. Very, very dangerous for the crews, as illustrated here. One of the merchant ships lost entirely. Italian torpedo boats coming out from Sicily, and by this point 9 of the 14 merchant ships have been lost in terms of running the convoy into Malta. This is the Brisbane Star at Valletta, one of the 4 cargo ships that does manage to limp in. Gives you an idea of just how heavily bombed Valletta was, and the rapid unloading that is required. And finally, on the 13th of August, the SS Ohio, which has literally been lashed together with a British destroyer on either side of it in order to get it in and deliver 11,000 tonnes of fuel into Malta, as well as 32,000 tonnes of cargo that came with the other ships. And this is Captain Dudley Mason, who, like Malta, another holder of the George Cross in terms of his conduct during the seas. And the supplies that come in lead to a very significant turnaround. This is Manole Island and the 10th Submarine Flotilla, now able to operate out of Malta. Typical submariners from this point of view. You've got to do everything, flying the skull and crossbones. But the PCS here is the Porpoise Carrier Service, because submarines were also bringing in very small, concentrated amounts of supplies, as well as striking against the Axis ships. But now that you've got torpedoes and things, you can possibly strike back against the Germans. And in the autumn of 1942, in the run-up to the Great British victory at Alamein, around half of the German and Italian supply ships are sunk by units operating out of Malta. Malta is also vital, though, on the other half that are sunk. And this is a German Enigma decoding machine. And effectively, we had very good communications intelligence on what the Germans were doing, where ships were coming. But we didn't want the Germans to know this. So we could never, the rule was we could never act on intelligence just that we knew from German signals alone. So you had to always fly an air reconnaissance over that the Germans could see and think, that's why they got us. And those flights are all flying from Malta. If you don't have Malta, you can't plausibly sink those German ships and the Germans not rumble that you can read all their communications. So the Germans, as they cross, are actually, in that run-up to Alamein, where Malta forces are now inflicting something like 40% losses on the Germans, even before they have a chance to get into battle. The Germans would have liked to have had a larger Africa corps, but they just can't sustain it in terms of ships crossing the Mediterranean. And here you get just an incredible thing. The Germans are trying to transport motorbike and sidecar by aircraft. Transporting vehicles by air is about 1,000th as efficient as by transporting them by sea. So this gives you an idea of the influence Malta has. The loss rate for the Germans is now up to 40%. To give you a comparison, in the Battle of the Atlantic, the maximum rate the Germans ever inflict on us is 2%. The other thing that we've only recently discovered, had the Germans had a larger force and pushed on into Africa, they weren't just looking for military advantage there, they were also looking to very much extend the Holocaust by this stage of the war. So one of the reasons for Hitler supporting the Afrika Korps is to push the Holocaust into Palestine, which is avoided by the fact the Germans cannot supply. The Allies, by contrast, can push all their supplies through successfully, new American Sherman tanks arriving, and the Germans, without enough fuel to move their tanks, are defeated at Alamein. Then the Americans land in the Torch landings in French North Africa, and through the latter part of the siege, late 1942 into 43, they are now sinking 60% of all the German and Italian shipping. So the Germans are literally running out of fuel and ammunition. And only 2 months after the fall of the Germans and Italians in North Africa, this is the invasion Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, planned out of Malta. The Lascaris war rooms are still there for you. And this again is vital in the war, because now you've opened a second front and the Germans have to divert not just aircraft, but troops from Russia. And in September 1943, the surrender of the Italian fleet, and they are interned effectively in Valletta Harbour. The success very much due to the conduct of all the servicemen, the merchant navy, these are survivors from the pedestal convoy, the Maltese armed forces themselves. Many of the anti-aircraft guns are manned by the Maltese. There are 4 battalions in the King's Own Malta Regiment. But I think, very much, most importantly, the Maltese population itself, the 270,000 people, given, like Britain, the advantage of being an island nation in terms of their ability to resist Hitler, but actually it was their determination that was one of the first serious breaks on Hitler's terrible ambitions. Thank you very much.